Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I am the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Axel Springer lecture entitled Why the Road to Syrian Accountability Runs Through Germany, which will be delivered by Deborah Amos, who is our Axel Springer Fellow here this spring at the American Academy. Deb Amos, I think, is known to most of you. She's an international correspondent for the National Public Radio and Ferris Professor of Journalism in Residence at Princeton University. The Axel Springer Fellowship was established in 2003, in the very early days of the American Academy, with the goal of promoting German-American dialogue in the fields of media, public policy, and other areas of contemporary concern. The Academy is especially grateful to the company for its support and to its CEO, Matthias Döpfner, also a member of our board. That support makes it possible for us to bring truly outstanding personalities from politics, journalism, and the like to Berlin for a semester-long fellowship. Now, Deb Amos is, as I indicated before, an award-winning foreign correspondent for NPR News, which regularly features her reporting on the Middle East and on refugees in the United States. Deb previously reported, she has kind of a track record of being at all the high-quality places, at ABC's Nightline, at Public Broadcasting System's Frontline. She is also the author of two books entitled Eclipse of the Sunnis, Power, Exile, and Upheaval in the Middle East, which came out in 2010, and Lines in the Sand, Desert Storm, and the Remaking of the Arab World, which came out in 1992. She has won a whole basketful of honors, including the Courage in Journalism Award from the International Women's Media Foundation, the George Foster Peabody Award, the Edward R. Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award, and an Emmy. Emmys are coming up, aren't they? On a personal note, I feel like Deb Amos has been a part of my cognitive universe for much of my adult life. And to explain, I grew up in the Connecticut suburbs of New York City, and like many people of my vintage, much of my youth was spent being carpooled by my mother, who drove me to school and back and all over town. And I don't know how she did it, but one element of her survival strategy was to have AM radio playing all the time on a news channel. Maybe some others of you had this experience. It certainly wasn't for the information value. I think it was a kind of oral narcotic. It put her in a trance so that she could get through the odium of driving obnoxious kids all over the place. And it turned me off to radio for a very long time. But sometime in early adulthood, I happened upon National Public Radio, and it was shocking to hear intelligent, informative reporting. And somewhere around this same time, I happened upon Deb Amos, who was filing these remarkable reports from all over the world. So Deb has, as they like to say, living rent-free. She has been living rent-free in my head for a long, long time. I think I'm just one of many who could say that. I was completely thrilled when I saw that she had applied for this fellowship. I just thought, wow, I get to see the person as well as have the voice in there. Much of the radio listening public in the United States, I believe, has Deb in their head, and I'm confident that she has been an unalloyed good for the Republic, which we can't say about that many things these days. To return to Deb's long list of honors, she was part of a team of reporters who won the 2004 Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award for coverage of Iraq. She held the Nieman Fellowship at Harvard. Good at getting academic gigs, aren't you? And she returned to Harvard in 2010 as a Shorenstein Fellow at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Deb has been coming to Germany to observe the Al-Khatib trial in Koblenz. The name refers to a detention center in Syria where torture was reportedly committed. When she began her residency at the Academy, her plan was to finalize her current project, The Long Road to Accountability in Syria. Her plan was to use the opportunity of this extended visit to gather interviews with the Syrian exile population in Germany and also with legal scholars and lawyers working on the case, journalists, etc., all to learn how Germans are responding to this fascinating case, court case, and this novel enterprise in universal jurisdiction. And as is so often the case with journalists, the world was not cooperative. Russia invaded Ukraine, and Deb, being that kind of journalist, has been following the events, and especially the arrival en masse of Ukrainian refugees here. Not surprisingly, the topic of accountability for war crimes has become even more important as the international community has rallied to Ukrainian calls for accountability for crimes committed on its territory. Ukraine has accepted International Criminal Court jurisdiction in principle, and that paves the way for investigation and eventually prosecution of war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity committed on Ukrainian territory. So the question that Deb and others are now asking is, will the conviction in Koblenz of a senior official of the Syrian government for crimes against humanity serve as a starting point for a new wave of cases related to Ukraine? Well, we don't know the answer, but we know for sure that the road to justice begins with the truth, and the truth can only be found through independent fact-finding and evidence gathering. It falls to me, Deb doesn't do things simply. Of course, we had to have a much more complicated event than usual. So it falls to me to welcome three other people who will be speaking tonight, who are in this business of truth-seeking. First of all, Ruham Hawash, Wasim Muqdad, and Andreas Schuller. And if I've done violence to any of your names, I apologize. I want to thank you for accepting Deb's invitation to be here. And it falls to me to, as I said, to introduce them. Ruham Hawash is co-founder and deputy director of Impact Civil Society Research and Development, an NGO based here in Berlin. She participated in the peaceful uprising in Syria and has been active in civil society and grassroots nonviolent movements since 2011. Ruham is now based in Germany, has participated in multiple conventions on Syria. She is also a board member of the Verband Deutsches Syrische Hilfsverein. She was a plaintiff in the Koblenz trial and also delivered a statement to the court before the verdict. Wasim Muqdad is a Berlin-based musician, also from Syria. He plays the oud, which I'm sure everyone here knows what it is, composes music, and participates with various ensembles. He specializes in several genres, such as tarab, dance, and traditional music, and he mixes elements of Oriental and Western musical culture. And when he is not playing the oud, he is studying medicine, and he's studying both medicine and musicology. So perhaps he will also tell us in which direction he's finally going to go. As a supporter of the revolution in Syria, Wasim was imprisoned 3 times. In 2014, he left Syria and came to Germany. In 2020, he too testified before the Koblenz Higher Regional Court in the Al-Khatib case. Andreas Schuller directs the International Crimes and Accountability Program at the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, where he has been working since 2009. The ECCHR is an independent nonprofit legal and educational organization dedicated to enforcing civil and human rights worldwide. Andreas works on issues including U.S. torture and drone strikes, UK torture in Iraq, war crimes in Sri Lanka and Syria, and other cases. He publishes and lectures widely on criminal law and human rights enforcement. So I have gone on long enough, and let me stop here and invite Deb to give her talk and discuss this critically important trial with our other guests. And just for those who are watching us online, you can start asking questions anytime. Do it, please, through the Q&A function. Don't raise your hand. And there will be even a bit of music at the end of this. So, Deb, thank you very much. It is in some ways appropriate that you are our last fellow presenting.
Uh-oh. Well, I thought I could do this, but it doesn't look like I can, but it's fine. Oh, good. Thank you for your assistance. I don't know why I can't do this one. Okay. Yeah. Oh, good. Okay. So I want to thank you very much for allowing me to go last. When your surname begins with A, you have been going first for your entire life. So here we are. This is the end of the semester. I am the last Fellows Talk, and we have had some memorable ones. We had a fellow who referred to a former president as Voldemort. We had another fellow who charmed us, dressed as a cockroach, and another regaled us and made us laugh with a talk about nothing. So it's hard to beat nothing, and the bar is high. I could spend my entire time tonight thanking the people of the Academy, but I will just say it's been a remarkable experience, including watching the lake from my window, from the gray winter to this glorious spring. I'm really honored to be here, and as you know, I'm the Axel Springer Fellow. I'm the only journalist in this group, and so I'm grateful for all of the academics who put up with me. Grateful to be part of this larger family, and I understand that I'm now going to have to relearn how to cook my own breakfast. Of late, I have been teaching journalism as well as reporting, and in my first class of the semester, I always tell my students that reporting is the only fun there is in journalism. The rest is work. There's the editing, there's the deadlines, there's negotiating with your editors who think they know the story better than you do. So I've had 4 months of pure reporting, and I've tried to make the most of it, and it's been exciting, it's been illuminating. So I will share tonight some of what I've found, because that's what journalists do. I want to go backwards just for a minute and tell people how I got here. Syria is not an obvious topic, but it's long been a focus of my journalism at National Public Radio. I've spent a career in war zones. I've been a war correspondent almost my entire career. The first war I covered was Beirut in 1982, the Israeli invasion. Except it took a while to realize that the story that we missed was right next door. Earlier that year, Syria's President Hafez al-Assad had ordered a massacre. The Syrian army besieged Hama for 27 days. And this was to put down an earlier rebellion. And in that operation, entire neighborhoods were wiped out. Syrians would spend the next 10 years in virtual lockdown. This was well before the era of social media, so it took months for the details of this to seep out. And only a few images have survived. In fact, a couple of years ago, I had someone send me pictures of that time. And so you can see what it looked like, very much like we see in Ukraine now. This is 1982. And this is about all there is in documentation from Hama in that time. Now, how many people died? Maybe 40,000. It's really a guess. The Syrian military operation on Hama has been called the deadliest act by any Arab government against its own people in the modern Middle East, and that is saying something. But that was until the Arab Spring in Damascus, and it changed the numbers again. I came back to Damascus for a long stint in 2005. I'd been part of NPR's Baghdad team to cover the U.S. invasion, but on-the-ground reporting was so dangerous that I made a case to my editors that Damascus was a better place for me to be, because at that time, 2,000 Iraqi refugees were crossing into Syria every day, and they were settling into the poor suburbs of Damascus. What they were fleeing was the violence of a U.S. invasion and also the rise of Islamist militants in Iraq. I could report on that, and that was my beat for the next 4 years. I got to know Syria in that time. I got to see the Assad regime up close. I even got an interview with Bashar al-Assad. I also met courageous Syrian activists who would play a role in Syria's rebellion in 2011. I met Syrian human rights lawyers, Anwar al-Buni and Mazen Darwish. They both spent time in prison for their work. I would reunite with them a decade later in Berlin. There's one more chapter I want to talk about in Syria because it's relevant for what we'll talk about tonight. In September 2015, Russia's Vladimir Putin directly intervened to rescue the Assad regime from collapse. While the Syrian president went about waging war on civilians, Putin's Air Force bombed rebel-held areas to dust. He targeted hospitals, schools, apartment buildings, bread lines. I slipped across the Turkish border to witness the carnage. Putin changed the equation, and he ultimately changed the outcome of that war. And he did it because he had impunity. Of course he did, and he knew that, because it was the same international response for his military moves in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Crimea. These were tactics he used again in Ukraine. In Syria, the international community disregarded Russian war crimes and regarded Putin as part of the solution, not part of the problem. So let's fast forward to Berlin in 2019. That's when I met Anwar Buni again, and he had set up an office in a film company that offered him cheap rent. He was part of a wave of Syrians who sought asylum in Germany. They were desperate to escape the war back home, but also to escape the Assad regime's tactics to quell the uprising. Forced disappearances, sweeping and arbitrary arrests, torture on an industrial scale to break the will of the rebellion. Some 800,000 Syrians arrived in Germany seeking safety. But among those refugees, there were other Syrians, perpetrators, who came to Europe, hoping to shed their past and disappear into the exile community. But sometimes, torture victims came face to face with their torturers. In a Turkish grocery store near Marienfeld, a refugee center on the outskirts of Berlin, lawyer Anwar al-Buni spotted a fellow Syrian emigre whose face was somehow familiar. I know that guy. I'm sure I know that guy, he said to his wife. It was Anwar Reslan, a former Syrian intelligence officer and the head of interrogations in Branch 251. He had defected from the regime. He applied for asylum, assuming his past wouldn't follow him. When what al-Buni remembered is Reslan had arrested him on the streets near his home, bundled him into the back of a car, and he would be on his way to prison again. For Syrian activists who came to Germany and around Europe, there will be no forgetting the past. They were determined to track down anybody who had taken part in the regime's brutal tactics, and they found willing partners in Germany to support that goal. In Berlin, al-Buni, Darwish built a network to gather evidence, locating torture survivors, witnesses, and they partnered with activist German lawyers at the ECCHR, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, as well as other German human rights lawyers. They were armed with a German legal system that allowed the gravest crimes committed in one country to be prosecuted in another, a principle known as universal jurisdiction, which we'll talk about with our panel. This year, I arrived early in Berlin for my fellowship at the American Academy, so I was only a train ride away from the courtroom in Koblenz, and I stood in line at 5 a.m. to get a seat so I could hear the verdict. The charge was crimes against humanity. This was the first criminal trial worldwide on state-sponsored torture in Syria, the first small chip in the wall of impunity. The defendant, Anwar Reslan, this former Syrian colonel, listened passively to the verdict. He was the first official to be held accountable ever. It's been a long, hard road, but I think Germany has opened a new front in the global fight for human rights. Hopefully it will pay off in Ukraine. The verdict at the end is a testament to the courage of Syrian survivors who testified in that court. For some, despite threats to their families back home. These witnesses spoke to the judges while the man who had ordered their torture sat a few feet away. You'll meet two of them tonight, and they can say better than I what a guilty verdict means to them. They also adjusted my thinking about the project I came here to do. The road to Syrian accountability runs through Germany. I cringe a little when I think about that sentence. That was the topic I proposed from my kitchen table in the middle of a pandemic. But a witness said to me, there is accountability, but there's another word, impunity. And if you think about it, it's not the same thing. Impunity is the problem. And for him, the verdict was a powerful message to say clearly to everyone, these people are not immune. Justice actually can reach them. They are not gods. We do live in an age of impunity, says David Miliband, the head of the International Rescue Committee, and he defines it in this way. When those engaged in conflicts around the world believe that they can get away with anything, they do everything. Chemical weapons, cluster bombs, landmines, bombing of school buses, blocking of humanitarian supplies, targeting journalists and aid workers, you name it, we're seeing it, and we're seeing more of it. And we are seeing more of that in Ukraine. Of course, as Dan said, a few weeks after the verdict in Koblenz, Russian forces invaded Ukraine, February 24th, 2022. The same Russian officers, the same soldiers, the same pilots who'd served in Syria, the same brutal tactics, too. The accounts of Ukrainian cities besieged by Russian forces were tragically familiar to the Syrian exile community. The bombardment of Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Kherson, a repeat of the 2016 bombing in Aleppo. Syrians headed to the train stations in Berlin, and they joined volunteers to help Ukrainians navigate an unfamiliar city, as they had just a few years earlier. They offered advice on some of the hard lessons they had learned, how to document war crimes. Syrians watched Ukraine's torrent of social media feeds and identified Russian commanders who had ordered the bombings of their town. Ukraine is a war zone and a crime scene. The work to gather evidence for war crimes trials has already begun, and the ranks of human rights warriors have expanded in part because of Syria. Germany showed that universal jurisdiction could be a tool, a strategy. After Koblenz, a second trial opened in Frankfurt, another is expected in the fall. Within weeks of the Russian invasion, Germany opened an investigation into war crimes in Ukraine. And in France, in the past couple of years, the most investigations in France have been about Syria. And as soon as the war began in Ukraine, 9 cases opened for French citizens who'd been caught up in the invasion. Ukraine was an obvious pivot for many who had worked on Syria. Some cases are likely to overlap. At the same time, there's been a new way to investigate war crimes, the rise of digital sleuths who use open source investigations, social media posts, satellite imagery, and facial recognition software to build war crimes cases. The core of open source investigation is to expose secrecy, but not by looking at secret documents. It is about looking at material that's already public and filling in the gaps. Many of these groups hone their skills and knowledge in Syria, and they are sharing it and employing it in Ukraine. For example, Human Rights Watch 2002 filed a report called Syria's Torture Prison: Forensic Architecture Investigators Reconstructed a Layout of Sednaya, one of Syria's most notorious prisons. And I'll show you this. They did these drawings based on interviews with survivors. These were ear witnesses. Nobody gets to look when they're in prison. People are blindfolded. And so they remembered echoes. They counted steps. They counted the number of cell doors opening and closing in a particular hall. Ukrainian sleuths are in Berlin to learn these tools. And you can see that you can go down the list, and all of these places have been rendered with ear witness testimony. Bellingcat is another well-known group. They got their start up in Syria. The New York Times picked up an early story that they reported through social media, a Saudi-funded shipment of arms to Syrian rebels sourced to a company in the Czech Republic. Bellingcat went on to do a series of reports on the Syrian government's use of chemical weapons, And of late, Bellingcat, their detective work outed a Russian poison squad that failed to assassinate Russia's dissident Alexei Navalny, and for their efforts, their site has been banned in Russia. Another development in this area is last year there was the first mock trial in London to test the reliability of open source investigations. There, you had opposing barristers battling over whether you could do chain of custody, whether all these images had been tampered with, could you verify where they were from? And at the end, the British judge, who now serves on the International Criminal Court, ruled that the evidence is valid and it can be used in court. There's one more group I want to talk about, and that is mnemonics. They're also based in Berlin. And they started out as the Syrian Archives Project. They were able to contribute to a criminal complaint filed in Germany and Sweden against Syria's use of chemical weapons. Mnemonics has expanded. They're now doing Sudan, they're doing Yemen, and their latest project, of course, is in Ukraine. Thousands and thousands of posts have already been archived since March. There's been a torrent of material because there's been first an advance in technology since the Syrian conflict began a decade ago, and there's new social media platforms. So that's also stirred up the volume. You know, in Syria, upload speeds were slow, so you got 12 seconds of video. Now, thanks to Elon Musk, there are hours of video, audio, pictures, and people can reconstruct specific events. Back in March, a White House reporter got President Biden to say out loud that he considered President Vladimir Putin a war criminal. It was a statement that reverberated around the world. This was the first time that a leader of one nuclear power was calling out the leader of another with words that have weight in international law. In some ways, it seemed to be a signal that the consensus was shifting, even in Washington, after years of open hostility to the International Criminal Court and criticism for the American failure to fully investigate alleged war crimes at Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and Afghanistan. In fact, the ICC has been revived. There is an infusion of support and cash, not just from Washington, but more than a dozen European governments. Even with all of this effort, it's probably unlikely that Vladimir Putin will end up in the dock, much less in handcuffs. In international criminal law, the bar is high to prove responsibility in a war zone, and it's harder still to prove national leaders who are not anywhere near the battlefield ordered troops to commit atrocities. But the further down the chain one goes, the less immunity applies. And in Ukraine, there are now some 7,000 cases after 2 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days of this war. It's painstaking work, and history shows that international justice is selective, sparing the powerful, and it does nothing to stop a war. But in this new era, it may be that Europe's national courts are poised to play a larger role at a time when international tribunals are politically blocked. Ukraine will certainly be the test. The story is far from over, but as a journalist who's covered war for decades, observing the rising price for civilians, when men who wage war can get away with anything and do everything, I'm rooting for the human rights warriors who are seizing this moment. Thank you. I would like to invite my panelists to come up to the stage. So, Wasim, I'd like to start with you. We've talked a lot about the trial and how it goes, and you've always been my sort of moral guideline of how to think about these things. And I wanted to ask, because a German lawyer asked me this, and I've asked you this before, and he said, you know, I understand why people might go out once, but I don't get why they went out 2 and 3 and 4 times. They knew what was going to happen to them. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you explain to people that even though you knew what was going to happen, you still went out to demonstrate the second, the fourth, and the fourth time?
Thank you for your enlightening words. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being here. This question was from the very beginning on everybody's mind, because like you start a revolution because of a reason. And the reasons were not only, it wasn't a bread revolution, it was a dignity revolution. So as we also, in the 80s, there was massacres on massive scale, but that's not when the regime started using torture and suppression. Like, we know that torture was used in Syria since the late 50s. And the Assads, the father and the son, used it from the 70s, and the Ba'ath regime from the 60s. So in Syria, we know that there is torture. We know it from other activists who were generations before us, other family members. You know it. And then comes a moment where the whole community moves. It's not a like individual level. It's not an activist who does things. It's masses of people. So yeah, you demonstrate against for a reason. And when the reason is the regime is murderous, yeah, you know that you might get murdered because the regime is murderous. But that's why you go on the street. So in a way, it's you don't go for your own safety or for your own benefits. If you survive, you will get of the collective benefits if this uprising succeeds. And if you don't survive, you pay the price that 50 years of silence requires.
Thank you. Raham, there weren't very many women who testified in Koblenz for all the obvious reasons about why it would be difficult. I was struck when I was in the courtroom to see how close Anwar Rislan was to all of you. I really wondered if I could have done it. And so I salute you for doing it. But did you... So there must have been a moment where you had to think, can I do this? It's a two-part question, and one is, how did you convince yourself that this was the right thing to do, and did you benefit from the experience?
Well, it was definitely not an easy choice to make. I also had the fear of being that close to him, also physically in the courtroom, but the main reason why I have participated in that because I had the right to do that and I wanted to participate that right. And the court was real. Everything was inviting for me to go and participate. I had suffered from the crimes that in this prison, and now these crimes are being sued. So I thought, why not? I can join that. And it was costly, of course. It wasn't like an easy journey. It was very difficult on several levels, also time-consuming and power-consuming as well. But it turned out well eventually. Yeah, and I'm happy I participated.
Was there a release from both of you? I mean, did you feel relief?
Yeah.
You go first.
I must say, for me, wasn't how long the sentence is the relief. The relief moment was actually for me to be able to testify. Because torture is not about the physical pain only. It's about the memories that you are worthless. We can hit you, and nothing happens to us, we own you. But also, those memories are valuable because I didn't want to share them on a glass of wine with friends. I wanted it to be documented properly. And once you start to tell it all over, then the story has its own livelihood. It starts to change, and I didn't want this. So I was grabbing on these memories and feeling the responsibility to keep it as personal and not to make it a story until I tell it in a meaningful way. And then came this opportunity because of a lawyer who is here now in the last row. Jumana, yeah. So, and then for me it was a moment, okay, this is a burden. This memory is a burden. And to share it in the court of law was the relief moment. I'm relieved of this, of keeping this memory for myself. And now I can share it with the world, and let's see what comes out of it. But at least I don't hold on this memory anymore.
Yeah, I could say it was exactly the same for me as well, that I didn't talk about these moments I've spent in prison to all of my friends. My friends were shocked when they were reading about the court itself, so, and about my participation, because they didn't know the whole story. Although I'm a person who is active and vocal and loud also in many cases and many areas also around Syria. But I couldn't share anything about my personal experience before. And I took that opportunity to do that in the court. I might have been relieved from my own story within the walls of the court in Koblenz, but eventually the idea that there are people who are still in prison in Syria, who are still suffering, people who didn't know that we are in Koblenz now suing this person, families for people who lost their beloved within this prison. That stopped me from being relieved for I mean, it was just like, this was good, but it's only a very small drop in the ocean, but I was happy. I was happy that we could do that, and that also this could generate hope for others as well.
Andres, I want to ask you about the legal ramifications of this. It's hard for me to judge because I haven't been here for other. I know that there's been other cases with the Yazidis. It's not that this is the first successful universal jurisdiction case, but it seemed like the one that everybody was paying attention to. And I wondered if you could just explain to us what it meant, both small and large, if you can.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try. I mean, there's been a number of cases against non-state actors, also as war crimes cases, not only as terrorism cases, but those are more regular in German courts. But this one was against state officials, former state officials, for torture, for crimes against humanity they committed as being part and officers of the state, of a regime. So. And that's not happening that often. So that was certainly one really specific aspect here. And the other one, I think, is also it was about a prison branch, about the head of the prison branch. There were more than 3,000, at least 3,000 cases of torture charged. So, I mean, you have two people here. But, I mean, the charge was 3,000 as a minimum. And he was only in charge of the torture prison for 2 years into the revolution before he defected. So imagine what happened since. That's already 8 years ago. It's a tiny bit on the one hand, but on the other side, it's the first time that the court of law also confirmed, and it's now also a final judgment, that the Assad regime commits crimes against humanity, so that can be also used for other cases. And it was not a single case, single act of torture, a perpetrator who is accused of one case, one international crime he committed, but at a certain level and more than 3,000 cases. So it was a high-level perpetrator already. I mean, one of many, but so that's so significant. And I think on the other hand, it's so significant because, I mean, in Germany, the Code of Crimes Against International Law came into place in 2002. There were no cases for 8 years. Then there was one on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, of a rebel organization. Then the first Syrian cases started, but I mean that's the first big one of a former state official, and again on a systematic case of systematic acts of violence and torture.
I want to ask about Ukraine, and then I'll turn it over to the audience for questions. And I will start with you, Wasim. And that is, when you see these generals, you know who they are, you know their names, you saw them on Syrian television. It feels like same war in two countries. Could you tell us what you're doing with Ukraine refugees and how, you know, they got war crimes, everybody's talking about war crimes a whole lot, 10 days after the war starts. It took you guys 10 years. Do you have any resentment to that, or do you understand why why the landscape has changed?
I agree that it's one war in two countries, but I also agree that it's one struggle toward justice in two countries also. So if in Ukraine if those actions can be persecuted in Ukraine, I would be happy, because it's the same perpetrators. And then we can learn also from the dynamics and the mechanics. How are you achieving what you achieve? With the difference that in Ukraine, the government of Ukraine is not killing Ukrainians, which is not a small difference. I mean it. That's why we cannot persecute those crimes in Syria, because who commit them is in charge of the legal system. So it's absurd. But also, as a refugee now in Germany, we know this pain, to leave everything behind and to seek, a new life in a way. So I'm doing my part as a musician refugee to help other musician refugees through an organization, German one. And but on the collective level or bigger scale, I would say yes. It's a lot of questions come. Are there jealousy about those are treated differently as you? And yes, they are white, and Europe is white, and the racial question is there. They are Christians, Europe is Christian, as if we don't belong. But I don't question that we belong. Yes, we belong. That's for me clear, and I don't need others to tell me that we belong. That's why I don't get any sense of jealousy, because there is stupid people everywhere, you know. But also, it's easier to compassionate with your similar, because you are compassionate with yourself. It's more difficult to compassionate with others, which don't remind you of yourself. Like it's easier for a man to compassionate with a man than to have compassion with a woman, because it's a different but I believe it's higher on the sense of humanity, out of that hormonal thing, that looking in the mirror. No, we don't look in the mirror. We are reading. We are trying to get this awareness. And to have a compassion with others is also, like, I have compassion with North Koreans. I don't have anything to do with them, but I have this compassion. And I believe a lot of us have this. It's not about only what we gain as, what I gain as a Syrian if in Ukraine something happened, but I don't deny that if we achieve the persecution of war crimes in Ukraine, it's also a push for persecuting war crimes in Syria. I need to admit that.
Just, I want to take a little dogleg with you, Ruham, and I know that you're working on a project called MP 2030. And I think because, you know, Ukraine has been framed as a conflict that was about democracy, and Syria was framed as a conflict about democracy. And that I find it interesting that you are trying to get Syrians here into government. That's what you've done with your activism here. Can you talk a little bit about that? And am I just, you know, making stuff up, or am I right in saying that your activism in Syria transferred to here?
Yes, yes. Well, the project MPs 2030 is aims to engage young Syrian people living in Germany, to engage them in the German politics, and we tried like through this project we try to provide these young people with tools. Like debate, political debate, like communication, like advocacy, even also initiatives. We support their initiatives, also social initiatives, because we see these people, and actually our project is not only for Syrian, but it's also for youth in general, for newcomers to Berlin and to Germany. Well, because we see everyone living in this area has the right, in this country has the right to participate in its politics and has a say in its politics, because it affects us, all of us, regardless of our residency and regardless of our nationality, etc. And because if we can engage these people. Also politically and socially, not only economically. Also, this can also empower them more to be also advocate for their community needs, to try to be this bridge between communities, the new community and the host community. So we see youth as a crucial actor for this change we want to see in understanding democracy, because it's not only about being able to vote, it's also about being able to advocate, it's also about being able to reach out, being able to represent your community needs and desires also, regardless of what residency you have or what you are bringing with. This is also from our point of view, is political education is essential for people also to be active in other areas. So all of, like in science, in economy, everything, like you need to have the access to the political system, to understand the political system, to see how this political system functions. And this is what we try to teach the students and participants of this project. And actually this project, or the idea behind this project, came because me and my colleagues and at the organization, we had these needs, and we developed this idea, and then we developed it for other people. Now we don't have time to join these seminars. But I try to read at night, so.
Keep one step ahead.
It is a need for newcomers. It's not only like, if I want to study or eat or find places where I can hang out, but it's also very important for me to be integrated in the political system as well.
Andreas, is this a moment, look, as I said, and you know better than I do, that the powerful are, use impunity just like, Assad, and I mean, that is the way of the world right now. Do you feel that this is a moment of change, that, the wave came with Syria and Ukraine is a different magnitude of what's happening, and that maybe there's a little shift in how people are thinking about this?
Well, that's the hope. And I mean, you had a very strong reaction with opening investigations right away in many different countries. It's the International Criminal Court, of course, also domestically in Ukraine. And I remember on Syria, we also started to work on 2012 already on Syria. And you really needed to go to different countries and really to push that they open investigations and look into that. And I mean, there are so many other conflicts going on in Yemen, elsewhere at the moment, where it's absent. There's the International Criminal Court is not there, it doesn't have jurisdiction. It's nobody really investigates and builds cases there. So that's different on Ukraine, and I mean, it has advantages but also risks. So it's I mean, hopefully with that, international criminal law is strengthened as a global system, also with global institutions, with domestic institutions, coordination and all of that. But there's also the risk if it remains a reaction to Ukraine, but then on other current or future conflicts, the reaction is then again less ambitious, I would say. Then this could also damage international criminal justice significantly, because then it's really more seen as a probably a Western or Eurocentric tool in those contexts, but it's not applied equally and globally. And I think that's what's needed, and that's where it needs to go. At least that's the aim we have, knowing that in power politics there are many factors that weighed in here. But we say Ukraine sets a new threshold, and also for new conflicts, that will certainly be the demand and requests, not only from civil society globally, but also then from victims and survivors and societies of other current conflicts and conflicts to come, I would say.
I'm going to open questions to the audience because I want to leave enough time for Wissam to play at the end. So, questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Josh?
Yeah.
Hang on, wait for the mic, although you speak loud enough, but wait for the mic.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Talk about speaking loud enough. As it happened, I was in Ukraine 2 weeks ago, and I went out to from Kyiv to some of the areas that had been attacked by the Russians, and there was a quick, as we all know the story, May 29th, March 30th, March 31st, withdrawal, and hordes of journalists came in, and human rights workers and officials. So my question really gets to the differences between the response to Syria and the response to Ukraine. And I wonder how much of it, this can be answerable by all of you. The question of the role played by social media, which I think it was not quite the same in Syria at all. I mean, this stuff is all out there, so tangible and available. The accessibility of these massacre sites. Bucha is a 30-minute drive from the center of Kyiv. You can be there and see the mass graves, and return to Kyiv for lunch. And these were events that happened only a month ago. So my question is the immediacy and the accessibility of these war crimes, and then the question of race, basically of racism, and the fact that you've got the West really closely identifying with white Europeans as opposed to the more difficult identification with Middle Eastern Muslims, Christians. So I just wonder if you could maybe evaluate why these responses were so dramatically different. Why, I think, Deborah, you pointed out in the course of a few days or hours, you had the talk of war crimes trials in Ukraine, whereas it took years in Syria.
May I?
You may. Any of you may.
I would paint a scenario which didn't happen, fortunately. If the regime or if the government in Kiev fall down, and then the Russians installed a puppet regime. And then, would we know about those crimes in Bucha? That's the question. We knew about it because the Ukrainians were victorious in northern Kiev. But do we know what happened in Kherson, for example? I don't. Do we know we know that Mariupol is destroyed, but how many casualties are there? We don't know. Because it's controlled by the perpetrators. And that's in my take, it's the biggest difference to what's happening in Syria. Normally, if you want to go to Syria, you need a visa from somebody on the borders, and the regime don't want you because they know that you are searching for the information that they are trying their best to hide. And that's when, that's where we come as a humanity to learn how to deal with, to speak about Yemen in a context about Syria and Ukraine. It's the good thing. That's what.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I might add something. There were information about Syria in 2011. And I personally was one of those people who went and filmed massacres in the nearby city and came back and uploaded these videos online and sent them out. But when I arrived to Hamburg in 2012, like many people asked me where you come from, I told them I'm from Syria. They didn't know where Syria is located on the map. So people are a bit selective of what they want to follow and what they want to support and how and with whom they want to emphasize. This is my personal point of view, and I guess for those who are interested, they will find information, but also some of the information we find, we cannot also trust them that much. So maybe because information coming from the Ukrainian are more trustworthy than information coming from Syria, because also of the distance between Ukraine and to Germany and Syria to Germany. This is also a factor that I might consider. But this is exactly why we need to talk about the Syrian tragedy, not from a Syrian point of view, and not from a Syrian angle, but from a humanitarian angle, like that this is happening in 2010 and this is still happening until 2022, and we are talking about an area on the earth. It's regardless how far it is to Germany, where we are living now. And this is why we need to mention Yemen when we talk about Ukraine, and we need to mention North Korea as well.
Andreas, you want to add?
Yeah, maybe only that I think, we said for a long time that Syria is the best documented conflict in ages or ever, I don't know, but there was a lot already online and posted and secured through Bellingcat, Syrian archives, those you mentioned. Of course, access is different, so that's why the work of forensic architecture, for example, is so important to remodel some of the crime sites. I mean, there was also sketches of the Al-Khatib branch, prison, and so on. So you try with other means, of course, to access the crime sites, basically, if you don't have physical access to that. So that's obviously different in Bucha and in Ukraine. But on Syria, there's so much information available on so many horrifying acts. And I also remember when Aleppo was attacked all the time. That was for some time it was daily news. There was a focus on that. Everyone was shocked what's happening then, but then it's normalized and people move on to the next. So now you see it with Mariupol elsewhere. So the question is also, how long does this reaction last? And because we've seen it before, and and life moves on. So, but I think again there's a lot out there also in Syria as well as on Ukraine, and that's important to document and then to build cases out of that.
Lawrence?
Thanks. If it's okay, I have two questions. One maybe for Andreas and the other one for Wasim and Ruham. For Andreas, I was just wondering if there's any kind of maybe queasiness with applying universal jurisdiction as a prosecutorial tool. We know, for example, that Germany did not, its record of bringing National Socialists to trial is not particularly impressive. And I just wonder if this becomes a way for a legal system to kind of package itself as this defender of human rights at the same time that it doesn't really reckon with its own legacy of human rights abuses. So that's one question. And then for Wasim and Ruham, I was just wondering if, and again, this is not really a legal question, it's more just kind of almost an emotional question. I mean, there are these examples of these things called like ex parte prosecutions, where you prosecute someone when the actual defendant is not present in a courtroom. And just as a symbolic matter, I just wonder, what would you feel about prosecuting Assad in absentia? Would that provide for you an important emotional, satisfying legal event, or was it crucial to have that defendant present?
You want to start, and then we'll go to them?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question, and I guess you see it everywhere, also in France with many universal jurisdiction cases, but no cases in the French history, in Algeria or wherever in this kind of thing. Same with Germany, with the history of not prosecuting Nazi crimes after there were the international tribunals and the post-Nuremberg processes. With some exceptions, like the Auschwitz trial, which today is a huge historic achievement, but it was very much an exception in the German judicial system. I mean, in that regard, my hope would be that, I mean, it took 2 or 3 generations of lawyers to also change the attitude to those cases, and I mean, now you still see some of the Nazi cases on trial way too long, too much delayed, of course, but way too late. And with universal jurisdiction, I think it's also interesting to see which cases you have, but also, of course, which cases you don't have and you could have. And I think there are many cases like my organization, ECCHR, presented over the last couple of years in Germany and other European jurisdictions. There was some persecution of LGBT in Chechnya. The German prosecutor didn't take. Now it's the same Chechen groups committing mass crimes in Ukraine, and some of them we know were even traveling to Germany, and I mean, not Kadyrov himself, but one of his closest people, and nothing happened. On Belarus, we filed cases, nothing happened so far. On Yemen, including against the European arms manufacturer that were fueling the war. And the same on U.S. torture in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. There were cases in German courts and French courts that led to some investigative measures, but also not too much. So it's very much selective. It's still meaningful, but it's by far not enough. And I think you always need to contextualize the cases that are happening and ask yourself, how did it happen that this case basically in the end was successfully prosecuted, whereas so many other cases didn't even make it to an investigation stage. And there are many answers for that. And power dynamics and diplomatic relations also certainly play a crucial role here, which for human rights organizations mean that we also know where we try to push for more. Of course, not to have only Syrian and maybe Ukrainian cases, also even those are very important to have.
And you two, you want to talk about whether
Yeah.
abstention is good?
Yeah, I might start. Yes, it would make us really happy if Assad was sued, even if virtually and even if imaginally, and this is eventually by Al-Khatib court. We wasn't happy about the destiny of the person who was imprisoned, but we were happy that the regime was recognized as a torture regime that uses torture systematically to oppress the people. And this is exactly what we want also for Bashar. We are not seeking revenge. We want recognition from the whole world that there are crimes being admitted against the Syrian people and until today, and the perpetrators are free until today. And it's very important as well for us now more than ever to sue this regime to make sure that this regime is not rehabilitated more in the UN and also other areas, and that they're normalizing the relationship with the Syrian regime is not accepted. So such courts and any court that would be like established against the regime is a win for us.
But I need to say that in Germany, the universal jurisdiction have no in absentia.
No.
Yeah, that's why. Yeah.
Hypothetically, we're talking. Right?
Hypothetically, yeah. Hypothetically, it would be great to document it, because with all due respect to journalism can be partial, but a fair trial is not. They don't have anything to win to help this party or that. That's why it's important to have such a document, like to say for the first time since over 60 years that the regime uses torture on a systematic way to silence the society. This is huge. But on which level? And this is also important, because I don't know if you are following the story, but the regime on the 28th of March, Bashar al-Assad, issued a law to prohibit torture. Although in the constitution, torture is prohibited. So I believe this law, where all members of the parliament signed also, it's a way to clear their names. They are afraid of it. They know that it can reach them now. Because why not before? Why not in 2021? There was no conviction. But now all know that, this might happen to us also. And now, especially 1 month after Putin was drowning in Ukraine. So if Putin falls down, Assad will fall. Then we can catch him, and not in absentia this time. So yes, I believe it would be amazing.
I'm going to say, do you have a question? I was going to say we can talk over dinner because I want to leave time for Wasim to play.
So, following in Lawrence's footsteps, I have two questions. Number one, just a point of information, what impact has the trial in Koblenz had in other European states that have had at least episodes where they were pursuing prosecutions under your universal jurisdiction, like Spain and Belgium? And then, I'm hugely impressed with all of your bravery and your stories, and so I apologize for being provocative, but I'm curious how you react when someone says, as diplomats sometimes do, that the problem with universal jurisdiction is that it threatens to prolong wars sometimes when you could actually get leaderships out. Now, it doesn't happen often. It has happened on occasion, happened in Africa, for example. There was a moment when everyone thought Bashar was going to go to Moscow. Instead, Moscow came to Bashar. But I'm curious what your response is when someone says that to you.
The first question.
Yeah, you always do the legal part, and then they do the emotional part.
So very sorry, just thinking about your second question. Just give me one keyword about your first question.
Other European
Other countries. Yeah, sorry.
or anywhere, not just Europe.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like a month ago, I was at a meeting of the so-called EU Genocide Network. So that's under Eurojust, where all war crimes units from Europe, but also US, Canada, and some other observers gathered twice a year. And we had one full day on the Koblenz trial. The prosecutor presented, the German police investigators presented, the forensic expert, Human Rights Watch, us, and Anwar al-Buni, the Syrian lawyer. And it was, there were 220 participants and from like all over Europe and those prosecutors doing those cases. And there was a certain atmosphere that felt that, I mean, people were very impressed by all those presentations and they were applauding, which apparently doesn't happen usually in those meetings. It was the second time in 20 years, I think. They told us, as investigators and prosecutors usually don't do that to others. I think it showed to all of them it's possible. I think that's the main message, that you can build cases and you can prosecute them and you can get a conviction in a court, because it's not easy to build those cases. The evidence is spread all over. You need to work internationally. You can lose evidence by witnesses not showing up or whatever, by a strong defense team, of course, as well, and so on. So that was quite remarkable. And on a diplomatic level, also ministers, foreign ministers, applauded and said, yeah, it's great, we also want to do that. And then you need to remind them that in half of the European countries, they can't do it because they don't have the legislation, but they don't know about it. So that's something we are also now working on, to use the momentum as well as of Ukraine to seek some legislative reforms in a number of countries, because many have the so-called presence requirement, so they can only start cases if a suspect is on their territory. Whereas Germany in 2011 started already cases and there was no suspect whatsoever here. That's more what universal jurisdiction also means. So it's encouraging and there's interest and momentum, and we hope to use it to build and enhance international justice.
You two want to speak?
Go for
it. About the question, if prosecuting the perpetrator would prolong the war, I would make it on a smaller level. If somebody stole a car and didn't fear any repercussions for their actions, they are not going to return the car and they will steal 3 others. And make it about murder, make it about rape, make it about controlling a whole community through illegal means. So, no, I don't agree with any argument like this. I believe if I hear such an argument, it's about why do you do it? Doesn't make sense. Or there is way more, there was this argument, why do you go after this colonel? And there is the heads of the army, and then you think, okay, so I don't persecute a perpetrator because there's other perpetrators. So, but how come though I persecute this one and there's also others? We need to start somewhere. And nobody on this panel, and I am sure, the vast majority of Syrians don't see this as a we achieved justice? No, we didn't. We cracked the door open a little bit, but in a room full of darkness, a small crack is making a lot of light.
Yeah, I wouldn't add to that.
Thank you. So we can talk about this over dinner. I want to give time for Wasim to play. And I often think of a discussion we had about how he trained to be a medical doctor but wanted to be a musician, but then went back to medicine for the revolution because he said you can't play to dead people. So fair enough. He paid a price for doing that. But I think we get the results of him becoming a professional musician, and we're very happy for him to do that. I'm going to have us come down off the stage, and then we will have dinner.